their bios into the chat so you can see them while they're presenting. And I would also encourage you to use the chat to share your thoughts and your questions about the presentations, because again, we're going to have less than 15 minutes at the end to have a discussion. And I know that your questions and your feedback will be very helpful to the presenters. And so I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to see your thoughts on their work. So first up today, we have Caitlin Ross, who's with the University of Colorado, Denver, and who's going to be presenting Contested Racial National Identity in Past and Present History Curriculum in Colorado.
Thanks. Hope everyone had a good lunch. I was kind of reflecting on my topic title and also the title of today's program. And I was just thinking to myself about how important acknowledging harm is in the restorative approach cycle. And a lot of my work has to do with trying to get educators and educational systems to acknowledge harm, because lots of times people like to kind of conceal it and move forward rather than truly acknowledging it. So like Professor Shomura said, my name is Caitlin Ross. When I'm not a graduate student, I'm a high school social studies teacher, taught in DPS for a number of years. And after I graduate this summer, I'll be headed back to the classroom full time, which I'm super excited about. And my research really kind of comes from where I was as a young first and second year teacher, where my assumption was I would go to a school, I'd get hired, and they would pass me some sort of curriculum Bible where I would be told what to teach, because that's pretty much how people had made it seem. But I don't know if I was just lucky, but I got kind of the benefit of being able to create my own curriculum right from the get-go. But then I realized my next challenge is I wasn't really adequately prepared to teach the way I wanted to, acknowledging historical truths, because I hadn't really been taught that. So long story short, that's what brings me back to graduate school and brings me here. So I guess I'll kind of start with the idea that education, public education in the United States, kind of stems from a need to prepare workers. That's like a kind of modern misconstrual of the truth. The truth is actually that common schooling arose at the exact time where white men were getting the vote universally, regardless of property possession. So that's kind of where I start, that not only is school fundamentally political because what we know is political and what we're taught is political, but it was very literally political in that its original intention was to prepare citizens for a democracy, white male citizens for a democracy that was based on white men. So kind of with that, I started wondering to myself, okay, I'm seeing a lot of racial problems in the way our democracy manifests right now. What is kind of the historical trajectory of how we've been teaching people to be citizens in our public schools, and how that process has been racialized and how political identity has been racialized in public school curriculum? What I found is a ton of research on basically saying that curriculum, is Eurocentric, it's white-centric, all that is definitely true. But there's a lot of research that says that. There's not a lot of research that actually digs into, okay, what exactly were textbooks saying, and kind of digging into what it does say rather than what it doesn't say. So that's part of my work. I also found out that there's really no research about history curriculum in Colorado. Most kind of critiques of history curriculum center on Southern states, which really kind of sets up scholars and sets up people reading scholarship to assume that racism is a Southern problem, which it most certainly is not. But that's really where the research is. Texas, sometimes California, lots of times Mississippi, states like that get a lot of attention. Colorado's gotten no attention in how they've taught history basically over the years. So my biggest question was, how has political citizenship been racialized in Denver Public Schools curriculum over time, and how has that kind of production of racial citizenship changed over time, because it has changed, but not as much as it should. So for my method, I found 19 textbooks, not just that were popular nationally, but that were specifically in use in Denver public schools for a variety of times. So from 1895 until now, I have textbook samples from each era. And obviously now, if you're in education, you know that education has kind of made a shift from textbook-centric classes to standards, either state standards or district standards for what students should be learning in different classes. And so my approach kind of covers the spectrum all the way from the beginning of kind of nationalized history in 1895-ish in Denver, all the way to our most current manifestation of Colorado academic standards that were just updated this last year. And I don't know if anyone has seen, but there's been some public outrage about them because they think they're too, or some right-wing activists think they're too inclusive, which they're most certainly not. So I think about how books portray citizenship. Books portray citizenship pretty much exclusively in like a constitutional sense, where your relationship to the state as a voter is how they define citizenship. So I look at how textbooks from 1895 to today portray Black male citizenship during Reconstruction and white male universal citizenship with the end of property requirements, and I contrast them. I also do consider some silences because textbooks are so focused on people's constitutional rights versus how people may be acting in political ways that are not with the system, but against the political system. So I also consider that, but a lot of it is text analysis of what books do include. So a couple scholars that are really important to this work, and if you're interested, I would super encourage you to look them up. Joel Olson's book called White Democracy talks really about like the political foundations of the United States as a white supremacist democracy. So I use that to talk about kind of the political and legal aspects of what we're seeing in the curriculum from back in the day all the way to now. And then there's two big educational scholars I use. I use Ellen Schwartz's idea of master script, which is the idea that all curriculum is made to support and further white hegemony, and anything that's included to quote unquote have diversity and inclusion in curriculum is really just a mask to support the master script by allowing certain aspects in from other communities. And finally, another important aspect to my work is the idea of illusion of inclusion, which is very similar. So by simply naming famous Black heroes or famous Latinx heroes, curriculum says, oh, good, we're done. We named two people. We don't have to change anything further than that. So those are all pretty important. Some of my preliminary findings are that textbooks really are mirroring the racial politics of the time of their publication. So something that would surprise a lot of teachers is textbooks are more overtly white supremacist in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s than they were in the 1890s. That's been pretty clear in what I found. Something else that I think is very interesting, books that kind of glorify universal white male voting are the exact same books that spend the most time denigrating Black male voting. So kind of how white democracy was dependent on restricting democracy for basically any other population. So those are a couple of things that I see. And I think I'm almost out of time. But one thing that I'm really kind of interested in extending is basically after the 1980s, schools pivoted to standards, which are really kind of famously vague. But I'm interested in how teachers of different identities and different backgrounds and different places are interpreting those really vague standards, because it leaves kind of a wide variety of interpretations that students could be receiving in different places from different practitioners. So that's what I'm looking into.
All right. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Next up, we have Raquel Guerrero of the University of Colorado Boulder, who is going to be presenting Chicana Reclamations of Indigenous Spiritual Mothering, the Complexities of Revitalizing Indigenous Maternal Spirit as Resistance Against Historic Trauma.
Okay, I have a PowerPoint, but I don't have to share it. I can just go ahead and just say what I'm going to say if that's easier for everybody. Okay. You know, before I get started, I wanted to just kind of mention, you know, my background's in symbolic and cultural anthropology, religious studies, and when I was working on my MA for in humanities, I researched danza Azteca and danza Mexica as a revitalization movement for Chicanexes, and kind of as a process of pushing back against these forces of de-indigenization and forced assimilation. So I am a mother to two children, Johnny and Adelita, and in full disclosure, I am also a practitioner of danza Mexica, danza conchero, and I do engage in indigenous reclamations of spirit. Let's see here, moving on to my next piece part. You know, part of engaging in this inquiry, something that I really have to engage with is this problematization of Chicanx reclamations of indigeneity and these critiques that have been articulated by critical Latinx indigeneity. So before I'm able to even really get into my research topic, I just want to go over a few of the main issues, and I can't go over all of them, but essentially, you know, within Chicana studies, you know, mestizaje and indigenism have been fetishized in some ways. And when we look at this history of mestizaje as a project of indigenous erasure, that's linked to a project of the Mexican state of creating a solidified identity for the Mexican people, we can begin to see why some of these critiques are there. You know, ultimately, CLI kind of understands Chicanx reclamations to indigeneity as rooted in a settler fantasy of indigenous erasure and sort of in creating an indigeneity. And that a lot of this is also rooted on this idea of land loss of the Mexican state within the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but something we have to, you know, really remember and contend with is the fact that the Mexican state and the US states are both settler colonial states. I think that these are all really, really important things that I really have to, in going forward in this research, I just really have to be really mindful of them. One thing that CLI does contend is they talk about spiritual reclamations are enacting an imagined as opposed to a lived or real indigeneity. And they also posit that spiritual reclamations comprise a sort of ideological archaeology. And I'm going to be kind of pushing back on those points because, you know, on the one hand, I think CLI is maybe falling into some of the pitfalls of reifying sort of authentic versus inauthentic indigeneity. And also this idea of saying that spiritual reclamations are ideological archaeology, I think is really simplifying and reducing actual religious experience. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, is the actual religious experience. So keeping all these critiques in mind, what I'm really looking at in terms of my approach is I'm going to be centering indigenous ways of knowledge production and also ways of knowing. So the sense of approaching it from an embodied knowledge, felt knowledge. You know, I'm also going to be including personal testimonio and also ethnographies through relational interviewing with Chicanas engaged in these acts of spiritual reclamation of indigeneities. So as part of this, I'm kind of calling this a methodology of spirit. I'm really drawing on Patricia Gonzalez's work, Red Medicine, and this idea of really drawing from womb knowledge and ombligo knowledge. And essentially what that's, what I'm also drawing my knowledge base from is my experiences with childbirth, nursing, labor, postpartum, menstruation, all of these processes of our bodies that have been medicalized in so many ways. But as Chicanas engaged in these reclamations, I'm really looking at how these processes are sacred processes, so sort of recentering that. As part of this, I'm looking at this idea of, in terms of my approach, I'm looking at this idea of presence. And this is, it's in religious studies. Robert Orsi talks about this idea of the abundance of presence and how presence, so spirit is actually present within images. It's present within our practices. It's present within our rituals. It's present within our bodies. So that's also what I'm drawing from here. So, you know, this idea again that, that our spirits are centers of knowledge production, and that it's intimately intertwined with how our bodies come to understand our religiosities and come to express them. It's probably kind of apparent that this really is a rejection of Western epistemologies and methodologies. This is not an objective, sort of neutral or distance approach. This is very much a felt approach. As part of my project, I am looking at what I'm calling maternal susto. And what I'm describing in maternal susto is this idea of intergenerational trauma, which is really accumulation of colonial trauma, historic trauma, and racial trauma, and how that's affected Chicana mothering. As part of that, you know, there's this issue of Marianismo and sort of, you know, trying to embody this idea of the perfect motherhood through the Virgen de Guadalupe as the example. And then on the other side of that, there's the shadow side, the colonial shadow of La Llorona and La Malinche. And I'm really also looking at how those infuse Chicana mothering, and how, you know, this has affected and impacted mothering. You know, how are these images, how are these maternal divinities and figures markers of shame, of resilience, of postpartum experiences? And I'm really looking to see in what ways Chicanas are honoring and nurturing these shadows, and how that can work to bring about healing. As part of this, I'm looking at this idea again of sacred womb knowledges and their connections to Mexica maternal divinities. I'm going to use this term ombligos of futurity. And with that, I'm really looking at this connection between the generations, a connection between our grandmothers, our great-great-great-grandmothers, our indigenous ancestors, but also the connections to our children. And, you know, in a sense, almost like a sacred center, like an access mundi that's connecting these generations, and how that's being done by engaging in sacred womb knowledges through this reclamation of Mexica maternal divinities, right? And how that can work to forge spiritual futurities. So specifically looking at modalities at curanderismo, brujeria, danza Mexica and conchero, devotion to the Virgen de Guadalupe, and also devotion to Santa Muerte. She's kind of a growing figure within Chicana religious movements. You know, how are these devotions and these practices enacting resilience to colonial trauma, as far as the actual ceremonies and rituals involved? How does the recreation and creation of rituals that honor the Mexica maternal divinities, how is that working to re-sacralize Chicana moon times, so our menses? How is it working to make sacred again our labors, our births, treatment of the placenta and the ombligo, breastfeeding and mothering as ceremonies? So I want to see how Chicanas are engaging in this on the ground, you know, right now, right? And I guess if I have an ultimate overarching question, you know, how does embodying the sacred enact a soul renewal and a healing limpia to maternal susto? And thank you so much. I think I am out of time.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Next up, we have Sean O'Neill with the University of Colorado Boulder, presenting on audio intersectionality, self-identification within the processes of interdisciplinary explorations in sound, music, and performance.
Thank you, Chad. Chad, I just want to make sure, because I am going to be showing a video, so that I have the share screen capabilities before I get going.
Let's make sure that we can get you as a host. Okay, I think you are a co-host, so
Okay.
you want to try sharing your screen?
Yeah, let me try it just real quick just to make sure. Oh, yeah, we're on. We got this. Word. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Wow, and welcome to Restorative Justice, Community Healing, and Indigenous Truths. I am Sean O'Neill, fifth-year PhD, ABD candidate at Department of Ethnic Studies, CU Boulder. I'm also a DJ, a turntablist, a sound explorer, manipulator, and innovator. And these are founding contexts of the hip hop movement that additionally includes rapping or emceeing, b-boying, b-girling, or hip hop dance, graffiti, or what we like to call aerosol art, but most importantly, epistemology and knowledge production that has been a deep component of my pedagogy and my art. So subsequently, DJing and turntablism exemplifies one of the many African diasporic art forms of performance and sound production invested with centuries of historical African magnetisms. And this is also an action-based representation of my theory and dissertation project that I'm developing, once again deemed audio intersectionality, self-identification within the processes of interdisciplinary explorations in sound, music, and performance. Now, audio intersectionality, or AI for short, is interdisciplinary histories, active responses, self-narratives, self-defenses, traumas, and celebrations regarding intersectional contexts such as race, gender, and sexuality communicated through sound, music, and performance, or in combined flow of the aforementioned. Now, audio intersectionality stems from interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary wisdoms within the scholarship of comparative critical ethnic studies to construct theoretical, autobiographical, and performance-based ethnographical principles critiquing and deconstructing racialized, gendered, sexualized, and class normativity, and heteronormativity as well, and is equally as important. Now, the theory is founded upon Black African feminism, womanism, which informs queer color analysis, and performance studies, which is used to analytically question racial and social injustices. Now, the intellectual purpose of audio intersectionality is to offer African American or continental and diasporic African folk of all genders and sexual identifications alternative strategies of resistance and platforms of activism, or what I like to call survival, via sound, music, and performance to actually challenge, interrogate, and dismantle male white supremacist domination. Conversely, this metaphorical interdisciplinary philosophy that I'm developing can also be applied to diaspora communities of, as I said before, of course, of African descent, Asian descent, Latinx, Chicanx, Middle Eastern, and all indigenous folk globally. Now, AI has 4 accompanying subsets. First, there's audio racialization, which are chronicles of race, racism, and racial ethnic self-identification conveyed by sound and music. Then we have subset number 2, which I call audio confrontations, which are direct defiances of systems of racialization through action and performance, often conjoined with sound, music, and performance, and often conjoined with audio racializations. Then we have our third subset, which is audio assigning or assignment, which are self-determining narratives of one's gender and sexual distinctiveness, which is communicated through sound, music, and performance. And then last, we have what I call trans audio, which shares the same purpose as audio assigning, but however, trans audio additionally uses sound, music, and performance to communicate race, gender, and sexuality as systems of impermanence. So trans audio moves beyond sexuality and into the deeper processes of frameworks such as Afrofuturism, which is the creative and culturally innovative conceptualization of alternative tomorrows propelled by African American and other African continental and diasporan folk. Now, the subsets of audio intersectionality can be used, importantly, for cis hetero-identifying folk as methods to reevaluate and deconstruct normative and heteronormative systems of domination. Now, on the evening of Friday, October 29th, 2021, the collaborative performance Posting at Keys was screened on the 7th floor of the Denver Art Museum as a part of the untitled Creative Fusions, The Spirit Survives program. Now, the performance played on a loop from 6 to 10 p.m., and audiences were given the opportunity to experience the ways in which we being myself and my dear friend, colleague, and collaborator, fellow PhD candidate in the Department of Ethnic Studies, Lau Malaver, to seek to interweave theory and praxis for social transformation through an anti-racist, queer, feminist, and decolonial perspectives. Now I'm going to show you, we're going to watch like a 3-minute clip from our performance. Let me share my screen. All right, can everybody see that? Bet. Now in the clip at Keys, Lau and I are meeting in a trans audio collaboration. Now I identify as a cis hetero male, realizing many years ago that factions of my life operate philosophically and artistically through Black, queer, and transgender dimensions. Manipulated sounds that include field recordings of birds and insects conjoined with a customized analog system at the moment of engagement with Akis's embodiment is an audio confrontation intersecting with trans audio. The amalgamation of nature and technology via sound molecular interactions creates hybrid remixes reminiscent of free jazz improvisational voyages. My experience of transness moving beyond sexuality is transported simultaneously by molecular disintegration symbolized by a flash of light and manifestations of looping sounds. In the clip, I'm utilizing live acoustic instruments, kalimbas, and bells as an encircling cacophony of protection, providing continuous spatiality and temporality that is often void in the lives of marginalized folk. The loops symbolizing the repetitions of survival that can slightly alter with each rotation. Thank you.
Really wonderful. Thank you so much, Sean.
Absolutely, thank you.
Next up, we have Roberto Monico from the University of Colorado Boulder, presenting Los Angeles and William H. Parker, Race, Vice, and Policing During the Red Scare.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to share my screen. I do have a keynote presentation. So can everyone see this? Good. All right. The reason I started this project was during my undergrad, I'm a non-traditional student. So I went back to community college and met a bunch of different people that had been impacted by the war on drugs, mass incarceration, and so on and so forth. And then when I transferred, I met a bunch of people who've been impacted by prison industrial complex and so on and so forth. So when we started engaging in a lot of reading, a lot in text and historical texts and through ethnic studies as well and sociology, a lot of it begins in 1965 and afterwards at the backlash from the civil rights movement. But when I kept tracing the antecedents of all this, I started looking back at LAPD and especially by this guy named William H. Parker, who implemented a bunch of policies that we take for granted today. One of them being qualified immunity. If you're unaware, it shields police officers, violent police officers often, and separates them from they endure a completely different criminal injustice system, if you will. So the significance of my research was to re-examine these policies and how they impacted a lot of people from working class communities in Los Angeles. And what I've discovered when I was going through the research is that there was a dearth of research that really been emerged between 1950 and 1966. Eduardo Escobar wrote this book about the LAPD that started from 1900 to 1945. And then we have historians like Elizabeth Hinton and Kianga Yamada Taylor who began in the 1960s. But there's this gap in this research that I felt like I needed to go in and delve in. So what I also discovered along the way was when the second Great Migration, when a lot of African Americans were fleeing the racial terrorism from the South, a lot of folks were going to Los Angeles, filling these labor shortages because of World War II. And a lot of folks from the northern parts of Mexico were coming also well with the Bracero program. And there was a collision people of Mexican descent, African Americans were on a collision course with the LAPD, especially with the William H. Parker at the helm. So we started implementing these policies and started targeting these folks. When I started researching, the primary sources of the LAPD's annual reports, I started seeing disproportionate rates of people arrested. And so part of my argument is that this began the infrastructure of mass incarceration, and a lot of times linking race to crime. So the theories that I used in this was specifically critical race theory, Cheryl Harris's whiteness as property, and counter storytelling with CRT introduction, because I started looking at other primary sources like the California Eagle, which was an African American owned newspaper that was owned and operated from 1865 to the mid 1960s. And it was vastly different. The stories that were being reported at that time were vastly different than what the Los Angeles Times was reporting. So the Los Angeles Times has historically been a pretty right-wing conservative newspaper up until more recently. Now they espouse, say that they're liberal. But if you go back and start looking at the earlier newspaper prints, especially them and the Herald Examiner, it was very right-wing, and they were very supportive of the LAPD and the stuff that the policies that they implemented. Especially when they were, I'm going to get into this in a bit, but when they were starting to write stories about people of Mexican descent having more a proclivity toward crime, they were always championed by William Parker and vice versa. So in chapter 1, I had to set this up by discussing William H. Parker, and this is a picture of him during a graduation in Legion Park, which is right adjacent to where the Dodgers play. But his racist views are really critical to my research, because Parker wasn't necessarily an overt racist in the way he spoke about it, but he was very sly, shrewd, and talked about people and criminalized them in a way where he circumvented using overt pejorative terms and racist language. He's responsible for professionalizing the police. And what I mean by that is he started to institute these police science techniques and methods. Augusta Vollmer first started talking about back in the 1920s, but for like 30 years, nobody was doing this. So Parker started to implement these policies. He argued for higher police salaries. It was one of the first times that any local law enforcement agency had a middle-class salary, if you will. Like now they were being treated akin to doctors and lawyers and other professionals. So this was the first time that this was happening. He kept a vast, he just secret files, intelligent files. He was always reporting, kept these files to make sure that that he can keep tabs on people that were ever going to argue against him or go against him. He essentially ran the city between 1950 to 1966 when he dropped dead of a heart attack at a banquet honoring him. And then Section 202 was particularly important because this was the precursor to qualified immunity. He wrote this in 1937. So it was really instrumental, and this is a policing, separate tiered justice system that has been emulated by a variety of police departments across the United States. He had a law degree, he was a World War II veteran, and he was a total right-winger, and especially in the Cold War sense. If you're familiar with this TV show from Dragnet back in the 1950s, he had the right to reserve scripts. He basically wanted to portray a quote unquote authentic portrayal of the LAPD as these like really, civil servant people that were just there to fight crime. But he, for the most part, controlled the narrative of the entire way we looked at LAPD. Today, we have a lot of propaganda shows that we have a slew of them, and the majority of them always portray police officers as people who are there to fight and protect you from so-called bad guys. This is one of his quotes. And he wrote, at the present time, race, color, and creed are useful statistics and tactical devices. So are groupings, sex, and employment. If persons of one occupation for some reason commit more than the average, the increased police attention is given to persons of that occupation. So he was a proponent for racial profiling. At the time, he didn't see anything wrong with it. So in chapter 2, I started to look at race, citizenship, and the deportation regime. So in 1954, Operation Wetback was launched. As a collaboration between the INS and the LAPD. And historians today have said that the numbers of people, over 1 million people being deported, it's just a hyperbole. There's nothing really to document that, but that it didn't matter because the rhetoric that was being deployed in the LA Times was enough to induce all these fear panics, and that there was some sort of crime wave that was coming from the Mexican-American community. So he went after a lot of African Americans too. He recruited some people from the South to be part of the police officers. And so I grew up in Los Angeles, and growing up there, I have to real quickly say that we always talked about this as kids, as teenagers, thinking like, it felt like it could have been something on par with conspiracy theories, but it wasn't. So the further I dug into this, I started to see some numbers that some parts were missing from the years that I looked at, and other parts were confirming that, yes, he did recruit people from the Jim Crow South. He also was very instrumental in creating these racial and ethnic enclaves. So if you're familiar with Los Angeles, you have South Central Los Angeles that's predominantly African Americans and now Latino and Latinx folks. East Los Angeles, people of Mexican descent. So he carved up the city. Mike Davis talks about this a little bit more too, but I go into this a bit further because the police officers that he deployed ensure that people were kept within their neighborhoods. So in chapter 3, I started to talk about the Cold War and how the LAPD was also very instrumental. So for example, he said that the civil rights movement was controlled by the Soviet Union. And again, no evidence was ever presented, but it really didn't matter because at the time, if you're inducing all these racial panics among the white base, who typically were right-wing conservative, they started to buy this nonsense. And so you start to see the civil rights movement in the 50s, not so much in the 60s, being combined with communists and people in the Soviet Union. He said weird things about the Third International controlling civil rights movements. At one point, the politicians in Los Angeles wanted everyone who was affiliated with the Communist Party or people who associated with left-wing parties to register with the LAPD. And it lasted for about a year until it was overturned. The John Birch Society, if you're not familiar with it, the Koch brothers, well, now it's the Koch brother, but one of their father was part of the John Birch Society, a right-wing fascist organization. And they fully supported Parker and his policing methods. So this is a quote that I was just referring to. This is a situation long sought by the masters in the Kremlin. The bloody revolution, long the dream of the common intern, cannot be accomplished in the face of a resolute police. And my final chapter, I started to look at the way he went after the queer community. At the time, the LGBTQ of these terms weren't really being used. They were using disparaging words to describe these folks. But what I also discovered was that they were setting up these stings and entrapment. So people who were looking for sex because in places like Echo Park or near downtown Los Angeles, folks were living in the shadows at that time, as a lot of us know. So the LAPD set up these things to arrest these folks. From there, I went into looking at drugs and how—
Roberto, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but time is up and
okay.
we need to move on to the next presentation.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
But thank you so much. Right, and then last, we have Crystal Luce from the University of Colorado, Denver, who is presenting on Indigenous critical discourse frameworks.
Thank you. Second, and let me share my screen as well. So I am a student at the University of Colorado, Denver in the research and evaluation methods at the School of Education and Human Development. And I've really been focused in on this idea of culturally responsive methods, specifically centered around Indigenous methodology. And I took an independent study one fall on critical discourse analysis, and this is when I noticed that there was a problem. But before I go into that, to let everybody know, this is part of my dissertation process. Actually presenting at symposiums and conferences is part of that process. I have gone through an IRB process, but to let people know that this is part of the process and I don't foresee any harm, but this is my way to gain more knowledge, more feedback about this idea. So just need to let that know beforehand. What I hope to cover, if there's enough time, is issues of critical discourse analysis, missing Indigenous voices, what I found thus far, possible elements to include, and where to go from here. But before I do that, just real quick, I always feel like contextuality is a little bit important and why I'm even interested in this topic. So my great-grandparents on my father's side were forced into the boarding schools. So I have that connection as far as knowing that I had great-grandparents who went to the boarding schools. The cultural genocide worked, unfortunately, in my situation, in that they decided not to enroll any further into the tribes. They decided to disenroll, and my grandparents were not enrolled, and thus my father and I are not enrolled either. But I still have this connection, and I choose to try to uncolonize myself and decolonize whenever I can. So that's why I try to bring forward Indigenous Native American voices whenever possible, and that's why I look for these sort of ideas. As I talked about in the fall, I did an independent study looking at critical discourse analysis. When I went to write my first paper, the person who was overseeing my independent study was like, just write about critical discourse analysis. What have you found thus far? I went to write it and this light bulb went off, which is that there were no Indigenous voices. I know that Indigenous people and theorists are talking about these ideas, but they're not being included within the critical discourse frameworks. And to me, that's rather problematic because they're talking about it, but they're not being included in this discourse, within this ideology. So real quick, critical discourse analysis. This is a rather rudimentary design of critical discourse analysis. But the idea with critical discourse analysis is that when we analyze discourse, we understand that power will shape discourse and discourse shapes power, that there is a relationship between those two elements, and that when we start to analyze them, we understand that there are micro levels that are occurring and there are macro levels, and there can also be this meso level where the micro and the macro meet. And so when we analyze discourse, we understand that context matters both from an individual experience and also from a larger place. And if we think of people such as Wendell Laurie Jr., it's this concept of power and place, that we understand each person has power, each person has place, but it's also part of the community as well. So within critical discourse analysis, people are constantly calling back to this foundation that is very Eurocentric. They go back to the Frankfurt School, they go back to Foucault, they go back to Gramsci, time and time again. Additionally, the leading scholars within CDA are all from Europe. It is Van Dijk, Fairclough, and Wodak. And that's who people consistently quote within that. So also, there is a realm within CDA that's growing that's called cultural critical discourse analysis. However, within cultural critical discourse analysis, what's happening is they still call upon those Eurocentric foundations. They still quote Fairclough, they still quote Van Dijk. And this is create problems because of differences of how people view gender and power, particularly between Indigenous communities. And so I want to be clear too that Indigenous communities are different from community to community, but these are things that we see time and time again, whether it be spirituality is different from an Indigenous community to that of the Eurocentric viewpoints. Connections with the land is the same idea as well. There are these differences that aren't being discussed within critical discourse analysis. And so within that, I feel like this image really explains this idea the best. So what I did is I did a bibliometric methodology where I pulled articles from a database and I looked for terms of critical discourse, because some people label it as critical discourse analysis, some people label it as critical discourse studies. And then I looked for terms that could be considered to be Indigenous. So Indigenous, Native American, First Nations, Maori, Aborigine, Aboriginal, tribes. I went through this into I went through this whole list and I found 125 articles that I pulled. I then found the limit was to at least been cited in 10 of those articles. And I looked to see, this creates a web of who's been cited the most within it. And additionally, the closer you are to the center, the more that you are cited. So Fairclough, Van Dijk, and Foucault are at the middle of this. And the only person on this list who happens to be anyone who recognizes themselves as Indigenous is Linda T. Oʻahu Smith, which is all the way down in the corner, is the little red dot all the way down in the corner. Otherwise, the S. Hall is Stuart Hall, who is from Jamaica, and Wodak, as I've talked about before, and then A.J. Brown is from Canada. So there's clearly a missing Indigenous voice and voices within this ideology and this framework. So I did find 2 articles though that have tried to at least either a critique CDA from trying to decolonize critical discourse analysis, which was Vivian de Mello Resende, who is from Brazil, or there is also Anne-Marie Jackson, who is from New Zealand, who incorporated Kappa Maori with critical discourse analysis to analyze what was happening with fisheries down in New Zealand. But that's kind of been it out of like thousands of articles that or hundreds actually I've been going through. There's a list of thousands, but I've gotten through a couple hundred so far. That's it. Everybody else is still using the same Eurocentric frameworks and still quoting the major 4. So I don't think with this group, I have to go so much into what the problem is and why this is problematic. I feel like this is an audience that would understand that, but just very briefly, it limits the views, voices, and contributions of those outside of the Eurocentric theory. They don't get discussed. They don't get that, the empowerment that they should. They are left to the margins. So we continue to engage and entrench the power dynamics that supposedly CDA is trying to erode, that continually just using the discourse of colonial individuals when trying to erode power just seems contradictory. also, those theories may not reflect the realities in which they are trying to critique and trying to bring to light. I feel like the last two are the most important. That what happens is we continue to discredit and disempower communities, nations, and peoples through this process. And ultimately, we're embedding colonialism further into academia. Because of this last semester, I've spent time with Dr. Donna Martinez, who was faculty at the University of Colorado, Denver, has now since retired. But we came up with a list of people that I should start reading. I'm clearly not going to get through all these people in this semester. It's a lot. I don't know if I'll get through everybody that I want to read in my lifetime at this point, because each time I come up with more and more folks that I want to read. But through reading them, I'm starting to develop what a potential framework could look like. And so that's where we're at here, that this is some sort of framework. That's questions to ask when critiquing discourse that involves Indigenous communities. So first off, is the author or a researcher placing themselves within the research? Did they talk about why they're interested? Are they part of the community? Speaking of which, are they working with the community versus on the community? Do they discuss impacts to the community and how the community could use the research that's being done? Also, dynamics of colonization, I think, is huge within this discussions of sovereignty, discussions of land, discussions of spirituality, also discussions of resistance and resilience. And then finally, is the language of the article relatable? And over here are kind of where I'm pulling from mainly at this point in time. Granted, all the people I've read kind of fit into this area, but the frameworks of Chalicia, who is from Ghana, and then George Safadi, who is from Botswana, are really who I've been pulling from, particularly this indigenous discursive paradigm. So the last thing I just want to kind of talk about is I then took this framework and looked at 5 different articles and pulled what they were talking about in their articles against this framework to see, A, is this already being done? And I don't need to necessarily do a specific, like, call it for what it is if people are already doing this. And B, are all these elements something that could be discussed within a CDA framework? And what I saw was no one article is actually doing all of these elements. But I feel like more importantly, there's no one element that's a no across the board, that people are talking about these elements within a CDA framework. It's just not all of them at once. And I do want to make a quick note that
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but time's up.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you so much.
The only thing I want to say is that I want to leave this poem. Is another form of doing critical discourse analysis that isn't within the indigenous. This is from Carter Rivard, who is Native American.
Thank you, Crystal. And really, thanks to all our presenters. We have I think maybe 5 minutes and a few seconds for a discussion. So I just wanted to say, maybe take no more than a minute to say some things about our wonderful presentations. And, we're not going to be able to get a deep dive into them and to really appreciate their richness. So I'm hoping that instead we can tilt our discussion to a kind of sounding board. What have these presentations really gifted us for thinking about things like healing and restorative justice and so on? Right. And, I don't want to do the kind of paternalistic backwards thing of saying that, this is like the future of ethnic studies here, because everyone's doing such cool, innovative and important work right now. Okay. And so I think, to frame things just really quickly in terms of 2 areas, I think each of the presentations really sort of challenge the ways in which state epistemologies and practices really shape the kind of historical and political context within which we operate, right? Either in terms of cultivating a certain kind of identity or kinds of constraints of identity, and also the terms of citizenship, right? Whether that's in terms of being a student or being in terms of an everyday person, just kind of like facing police surveillance, right? And in addition to that, we have what Crystal, I think, was showing us too, is that it's not only the epistemologies of the state, but how do our critical discourses perhaps risk falling into the trap of reproducing those state epistemologies and the kind of Eurocentric Western frameworks from which they emerge. And so the real question, I think, at the heart of these presentations is what can be done. Right. I think Caitlin, really showed us that while textbooks mirror the racial dynamics of the time, and the question is, how can they intervene in those racialized dynamics? So if we can talk about Olson's abolition of white democracy, can we imagine an abolition of white textuality through a kind of textbook politics? I think Raquel, really navigating the really difficult lines, right, of how to enable a reclamation of indigeneity without reifying the kind of state erasures of indigenous peoples, right? And maybe there's something about starting with these embodied practices, from the womb, from menstruation, that are really sacred, and kind of drawing out that richness and that detail before dumping in the problems of, is it authentic or not? Does it reify or does it reduce religious experience or not, right? Can we, develop the details and the richness of those worlds before, dumping in our critical analyses? Similarly, I think with Sean, I love this idea of the epistemology of the turntable as a kind of way of spinning out survival through sound, music, and performance. And I think one thing that you really gifted us is that sound and music are not just mediums from what you're looking for, but they're an enactment of what you're looking for. So it was an enactment in the performance itself, and another enactment in terms of what you brought for us today. Roberto, I'm really fascinated by your presentation and the way in which you look back in terms of the sort of prehistory of carceral studies to examine a really overlooked period. And I think in particular, what's important is you show that the professionalization of the police and the development of an epistemology of police science are really critical here, both in terms of the mechanisms of surveillance, which are so easy for a lot of critical attention to go to, but also the notion of the bureaucracy. Right? Hannah Arendt talks about the bureaucracy as kind of instrumental to the genocide conducted by the Nazis, right? The bureaucracy enabled a certain form of knowledge. And then the question is, in the contemporary context in which the bureaucracies are exacerbated through like datafication, right? What can be done now? And I think the historical approach you give is one angle. And then finally, Crystal, I think one thing important you're showing us is that it's not just the content of Eurocentric thinkers, but the citationality and the citational practices, right? I was really stunned by the visual map that you gave for us. And that really, I think informs us, where are we getting our knowledge? Who are we citing? And maybe it's not about, whether or not a certain thinker gets things or not, right? And having those arguments, but looking at who people are turning to and who people are turning away from. And I think that list that you gave us at the end is a really terrific gift. I took more time than I was supposed to. We have like maybe a minute to talk about things. So if anyone wants to throw out a few thoughts or questions, please do.
I have a quick thought. First of all, Faye, thank you. And you're going to have to introduce this little cutie that you got on the screen there. I know this doesn't pertain to these presentations, but I mean, really?
I was just taking Raquel's lead, her invitation to, show mothering on the screen. We are just about out of time, but I think there were a couple of questions that popped up in the chat. There was one for Raquel. How do you feel about the monetization of postpartum healing remedies that many Latinx mujeres have known for years, like what we are seeing on Instagram? A lot of this knowledge has been passed down from my grandma and mommy, and it always feels weird to see women on social media offering classes. And then the other question was for Roberto. Roberto, have you found that Parker was in contact with other heads of police departments in promoting these kinds of racist practices and policies, either in other cities in California or in other states? I ask because I'm noticing numerous parallels with W. Cleon Skosin, who became head of the Salt Lake City Police Department in 1956. I don't know if you could quickly answer those questions. But I wanted to throw those out there since they were in the chat.
I can just really quickly, I was just typing up a response to Abby. Yeah, I just, I wanted to say, I think anytime anything gets commodified, it's super problematic, but particularly when it comes to religious, and our medicines are tied into our religious experiences, right? And it's hard because on the one hand, like, people are trying to find these processes again. For some of us, our grandmothers have been, passed away a very, very long time ago. And so it's kind of like, how do we engage with community elders, who we can still learn from? At the same time, I might actually know the person you're talking about, because there's a person in town that it's like her business, and it's dicey. And I'm an anti-capitalist at heart anyway, so I don't like the idea of commodifying anything. I think if knowledge can be given, and some experience, I think that there's ways where we don't have to make it our living or in terms of money. But on the other hand, I also understand people are trying to make people are also struggling to survive in a capitalist society. My dad always said, damn it, I'm a capitalist because I'm in this culture, right? He's like, I'm in this society, but I don't want to be. How do we break out of it? And I don't know. But that's a really good question. It's a lot to think about. Yeah, please feel free to email me.
Right, I want to thank.
Yeah, and just real quick.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No. You go ahead.
Just real quickly, I didn't find any evidence that he was in direct contact with this chief of the Salt Lake City, but he did speak, a lot of conferences and would just create this hysteria, this racial hysteria. And the LAPD for the most part created this curriculum that was implemented in, for training programs, had to be more quote unquote sensitive toward minorities and stuff. And a lot of police departments across the country at that time started to flock wherever the LAPD and his minions were presenting these ways to implement policies and methods. So, but that doesn't mean he wasn't in direct contact with these people, but I didn't find any evidence that he was talking to specific people, but they all looked at the LAPD at that time is what I found. So that's very important.
Okay. Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists on the really fascinating research that you've presented today. It's really exciting to see what our graduate students are doing. And thank you, Chad, for facilitating the panel and for really interweaving and finding the important parts and the ways in which the papers connected. We are our next panel, the alumni panel, is at 2:30. So we have an 11-minute break. I don't know how it is where you are, but it's beautiful outside in Denver. So you might want to just enjoy the sunshine for a few minutes before coming back in for the alumni panel. I will see you all in 11 minutes. Thank you.